it's sort of easy to like judge or laugh at the sacred. Like if you don't feel connected to it, you sort of like, okay, so these sort of like magical thinking people are not grounded in the reality of what financial systems and how the world actually works. And then, the magical thinking people, it's like, wow, these finance folks, they don't understand what's important or real. And so it's not enough to have just one. We actually need both groups working together in a way that really listens.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Troy Carter from Earthshot Labs. In this wide-ranging discussion, we talk about what is Earthshot Labs and what are some of the projects they've been incubating. We go into how do we bring the sacred back into money. What I love about Troy is how he recognizes and plays with this paradox that carbon markets risk financializing nature, and yet they're still important, and yet we still need to evolve beyond them. We talk about some of the current limitations and challenges in carbon financing and development projects. We also envision what the funding market structure might look like for environmental projects across different durations, risk levels, and pools of capital. We also discuss Troy's approach to the space, including themes like collaboration, hosting events, building relationships, open source, and transparency. And finally, we discuss the role of technology and some of the intersections with Web3. This conversation was recorded at SF Climate Week in April 2023. Let's dive in. Troy Carter. We're here with Troy Carter. Troy is the founder and CEO of Earthshot Labs. Thanks for being here, Troy.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
So what is Earthshot Labs?
What is Earthshot Labs? The most simple explanation is that Earthshot Labs is about nature restoration and conservation. So we develop technology and financial tools to do reforestation, to protect, remaining primary rainforests. Because what the world is facing right now is a crisis on many levels. We think of it as the climate crisis very often, but it's more than just a climate crisis. It's more than just about drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere and putting it into a durable form. It's about restoring the fundamental relationship between the humans and the other species. It's about changing incentive structures for indigenous folks and smallhold farmers and communities throughout the world so that they're allowed to be in right relationship with their land and have agency over their decisions rather than being pushed really hard by the economic realities of our world. So Earthshot, we build technology for carbon project development to get land stewards paid. And we do scientific ecosystem forecasting that allows land stewards and investors to understand what the future of the planet looks like so that they can, accurately reflect their investments in carbon and reforestation projects. I would say maybe there's another layer, like that's sort of what we do. One is what we do, and another is how we do it. And how we do it is maybe a bit aspirational, right? That what we do is changing systems on the planet, but how we do it is changing culture or changing ourselves to stay in alignment, to stay in integrity. So we host retreats for our team, and we are in an experiment to understand how an organization can be in integrity. Like, how many big tech companies do you know that you're like, this represents the best wisdom of humanity? Like, it's not maybe any. And so the bar is pretty low for what organizations have done so far. And so how is it possible that individually we sort of all know what needs to be done? Yes, we need to restore relationship with, degraded ecosystems. And so how have we not gone about and done that yet? So it's like collectively we've made stupider decisions than we would individually. And that the organizations we have created to be of service to ourselves and the planet turns out are sort of like have perverted incentive structures. So Earthshot is also an attempt to create a healthy organization, as simple as that serves the people that are part of it, that serves the people that interact with it, and serves the whole planet.
And how do you do that within the confines and context of being an organization that has to still participate in this system in some way or another? Like, where do you push the edges and the boundaries, and where do you say, oh, well, the existing rule set is good enough here? And how's that journey unfolding?
Truth is, I don't know. I really don't know. And I would say I've been dramatically humbled by the process of trying to create something that I think respects and values employees as sovereign beings who can make autonomous decisions, but also need to work together. And there's a saying in some intentional communities, like you can it's not quite as easy as just entering into a new structure and then it being like an ideal situation for everyone. Like, there are forces from the outside, and just take the simple example of a bunch of people working in San Francisco means they have to pay high rent in San Francisco, which means they need to get paid a lot of money. The more money our employees get paid, the less money goes to land stewards. So there's an inherent tension in rewarding people and equity that's not resolvable within the organization very easily. We host retreats, every quarter or every once in a while, and those are times for us to come together and form more coherence and learn to love each other more and connect with nature. That's a really beautiful time.
And I mean, last night you hosted a climate meetup, a monthly meetup here at SF Climate Week. And I was struck by, we had breakout sessions, and your breakout session was about love and finance, and your ability to articulate some of these, let's call them softer or less conventional topics associated with the nuts and bolts of climate finance and carbon and technology. And you're immediately bringing the conversation to consciousness and love and, the philosophical underpinnings of what are we all trying to do here. Help me understand better, your thought process and how you're viewing the overall situation that we're in, and how your style of leadership in terms of trying to broaden this conversation.
Yeah. So I definitely don't want to pretend I have it figured out yet. One of the things that I notice in climate finance or in funding carbon removal projects, for example, is that the priority is about climate. It's about removing CO2 from the atmosphere, putting it in a durable form. And so it is sort of reductionistic optimization that sort of allows civilization to remain functioning. And that won't be enough. And one of the reasons it won't be enough is that you go talk to sort of normal people, people not in the carbon removal industry or in carbon markets or in finance. And you talk to them about carbon markets and they're like, it kind of feels like bullshit, right? Especially when you talk about things like additionality, it's an accounting mechanism where we're paying people for stuff that otherwise may or may not have happened. People don't believe in it. And when you talk to people about ecosystem restoration or restoring land agency for indigenous people, they're like, okay, I can see that that is valuable. Like I can believe in that. So there's something about the reductionism in carbon markets that actually alienates 7 billion people. And which is sort of means to me that probably then regulations won't follow, which means that, and you think of, you go to the Amazon and you talk to indigenous folks there, and they're still like, we don't want to have anything to do with carbon markets. It's again a re-commoditization of the sacredness of our land. We'd rather not do it. And maybe we have to, because otherwise these mining companies or forestry companies will come in and, tear down the trees. But we don't want to. And so there has to be a way of marrying sort of like soulfulness and sacred relationship that people have had with land forever, and like functional, practical systems that reflect that understanding. And I mean, and I can talk about my perspective of how those functional systems should play out over the coming years. But they need to be rooted in something that is real for people, that have a real emotional attachment to, rather than something that is very abstract, that everyone will always try to game or get around.
Yeah, I feel like Charles Eisenstein articulates it so beautifully in Climate: A New Story, and just isolating this one variable and this one metric of carbon, even though it's clearly important to the functioning of our biosphere, it risks, and I think is playing out this way, that there's a whole slew of unintended consequences to acting in that way. But also it doesn't really get to the deeper roots of the problem of how are we in relationship with our entire ideology and cosmology and view of ourselves and nature and the rest of non-human life on this planet.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so, there's many layers of change. I also love Charles. We interviewed him for the podcast. He's a very dear friend.
Oh, nice. Give a pitch for your podcast. What's your podcast?
The Earthshot podcast. We host conversations like this with friends that we think are cool, that have something to say on how to bring soulfulness into carbon markets, into finance, into scaling up ecosystem restoration. Because it's also, I was at a gathering of indigenous elders the other day, a few weeks ago, and that's also not quite enough, where it's like, we are going to focus on the prayer. We're going to focus on bringing our integrity and ceremony and, cry for unity with nature. Like that's what we're doing. That's also maybe not enough. Like, I hope it's enough, but it might not be enough, because it's sort of easy to like judge or laugh at the sacred. Like if you don't feel connected to it, you sort of like, okay, so these sort of like magical thinking people are not grounded in the reality of what financial systems and how the world actually works. And then, the magical thinking people, it's like, wow, these finance folks, they don't understand what's important or real. And so it's not enough to have just one. We actually need both groups working together in a way that really listens. And so that's also what Earthshot is trying to do. Like, can we be connected to both groups? And so that when we do a fundraising process or a sales process, that we can speak to the integrity and sort of like desire of why that person has $100 million budget for buying carbon credits. Like, to speak to them and say, like, I understand why you're doing this. You want to protect ecosystems and love the same things that we love. So let's work together, but not just try to rationalize it to say, okay, then you can meet your corporate pledge compliance, and then you won't sort of get blacklisted by the market. Like, that's another reason, but on an individual level, the individuals making those decisions are usually making them out of love for what they want and working really, really hard. Yeah.
Are there any other kind of motivations that you feel like are not being spoken to in the traditional way that we're framing the environmental movement, that you feel like are important at the outset of uncovering and deepening the conversation around?
You said something before this interview started, of something I said last night, which is nature needs to be an investable asset class, even if it's a bad idea. And that is kind of what I believe. I actually sort of fundamentally believe it's not a good idea. Like, it needs to also be composted, but that's not where we are right now. Right now, the problem is we are already financializing nature.
Right.
And we call it forestry, and we call it mining, and natural resources, right? The whole planet as a civilization is viewed as a resource for the humans, right? And that within that frame, we need to monetize the value of ecosystem services for the humans in order to maintain balance and survivability for the species. However, that's also quite near like short-sighted, because what we really need to do is restore relationship, where a jaguar does not exist for the benefit of the humans. It exists as its own entity, as its own being, with a life that is as fully complex as any human beings. And so, okay, so it's easy to assign consciousness to a jaguar, but what about trees? What about, all the other layers of species, including the ones that are not perceivable by humans, like in soil, the trillions and trillions of microorganisms in each tiny amount of soil.
Totally.
To have a level of respect for the complexity of life is incredibly humbling. And then it brings us back to the place of stewardship, where we're not doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for the whole. And so I don't know that shift comes about by building good carbon policy, and we still have to build good carbon policy. Yeah.
Right. I completely agree. And I think even one step further there's the monetization of nature as an asset class that serves its protection and stewardship. But it's also about how do we rewild money itself? Like, how do we innovate money so that it's more congruent with living in harmony with the rest of life? And Biome Trust, our philanthropic expression, we're using the term rewilding resources. Like, how do we actually move these things that have become so commoditized, whether it's in the financial context or the way we treat nature, and like really bring that spirit and that ethos of recognizing that this is a living planet and consciousness is imbued within all things, and without getting too animistic and cosmological about it, but
we'll do that after the interview.
Okay, we'll bookmark that. So maybe to segue into a bit deeper of Earthshot Labs, like my first introduction to Earthshot Labs, I was sitting on the farm in New Zealand, browsing Discords and Slack channels of various convenings of Web3 projects and people who are more ecologically minded. And I stumbled on Earthshot Labs, and I remember seeing the Slack channel and reading the intros, and there was just like one after another of like incredibly talented people all over the world. And like, this is what I'm working on around satellites and Earth-based imagery, and here's what I'm doing around soil testing and conservation. And so how did it go from that into where we are today, and maybe describe a bit of the initiatives?
Yeah. So I started the Slack channel. We now call it the Earth. Well, actually, it was the Earthshot Institute. Now it's called Collaborative Earth. It's a nonprofit now. And I started on a whim. I was like, okay, I want to invite some of my friends, and I want to understand how to do ecological forecasting, because there's some interesting problems that I would like answers to. For example, in California, how do you restore the water cycle in California? Clearly, there's some broken pieces, but could you build a model that's comprehensive enough that you could go to the government of California and say, if we do these 10 things, that would restore the water cycle, and then there'd be more water for everyone. And so you need a scientific, like quite a complex ecosystem model to this. So I invited a bunch of my sort of data science, machine learning, academic friends. And we're like, let's build some models together around tree growth, around water, around soil. And after a few months of doing that, it sort of snowballed. Like, all those people then invited their friends, who invited their friends, who invited their friends. And suddenly there are, dozens of people a day showing up. I'm like, I don't know what's happening anymore. People just want to contribute to something that they're passionate with their life about, and no one is giving them the opportunity to use their talent. They're either using in academia to write a paper that no one ever reads, or they're using at a fintech company that's trying to be a middleman to transaction, or like things that don't touch their soul's purpose. And so just giving them the opportunity to say, you belong here and we can use your talent for something that is important. It's like everyone wanted to be a part. And so our challenge was like, okay, we've got thousands of people now. Like, what do we do with them? And which is quite a management problem also when you're not paying people. And so we went for, a year and a half doing that or so, and learning a lot, myself learning a lot about carbon markets, around finance, around ecosystem forecasting, around what are the opportunities for technology to support these problems, because it's very easy to say we're going to build a tech company and we're going to use technology to solve ecosystem restoration, but it's mostly not a technology problem. It's mostly like water and like trees and soil and people and relationships. Like it's a very tangible physical problem. So that at some point, we got some grants from the National Science Foundation, and at some point we just realized we have to pay people, otherwise they can't commit enough time. Like they have families to feed and expenses. And so we started a company. We raised a $7 million seed round and went out with the premise to create a technology stack for ecosystem restoration. How do you get a land steward paid? And the question is like, if the experience of a land steward changes because they're like, hey, you can do cattle, or you can cut down the forest, or you can maintain or restore the forest. If maintaining and restoring the forest is an economically competitive option, a lot of people are going to do that. So can that be the case? And there's many, many things. And so carbon markets are right now one of the only mechanisms for getting people paid for doing good things for the world. So it's very complicated to start a carbon project. It can take years to get it set up, even before doing any of the actual on-the-ground operations. And $1 million, $2 million in setup costs for scoping and feasibility studies and project design documentation and registration on Vera, validation, verification events for assessing, biomass studies, baselining. Like, there's a lot of complexity that if you imagine a land steward in a rural place with not many resources to go do this process, it's not possible.
Yeah.
So it's our responsibility to manage that complexity on their behalf, where they just have to do the operation, plant trees, do conservation, do agroforestry. And then there's also a financing gap. So, okay, we've developed this great project, but actually costs money to plant trees or to, institute new, land management policies or whatever it is. Someone's got to pay for that up front. And that's why it needs to be an investable asset class, because the scope of philanthropy right now is not large enough to address the size of the ecological crisis. So where's that money going to come from? It has to come from people's retirement accounts and pension funds and corporations and maybe governments. So in that sense, the upfront capital to do these projects has to be an investable asset class. And maybe I can speak to another question you asked earlier before this interview, is what are people doing right now, like tech companies? And what I often see is that it's very popular to make marketplaces, because you can think of popular marketplaces like Airbnb or Uber, where there's a transaction and then the technology company that runs that transaction becomes really huge and you become rich, right? Very attractive. And so what most people view the carbon market is a spot credit market, where a project generates a credit and then you distribute that credit to corporate buyers or individual buyers. That's not, to me, what the market is. I think that's a distribution channel for credits that are already generated. But a more interesting market is a market for investments where you are actually catalyzing projects to start, and then investors are getting access to deals, of which then there can be offtake agreements or buying from corporations.
What's an offtake agreement?
An offtake agreement is a contract to buy carbon credits in the future, or the option to buy carbon credits in the future. So you can think of Microsoft or another large tech company. They do offtake agreements to purchase carbon credits up to 2030, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that de-risks this process, because it's like solar, right? Mm-hmm. If you already have a contract to sell your power back to the grid at a certain price, then you can know the return profile. And then you're like, yeah, if it only takes 6 years, then I'll put solar on my house. But if you don't have a contract, you don't know, well, maybe you won't do solar, even if you think it's a good idea. So that's the same state that carbon is in right now. It doesn't have the maturity to have offtake agreements, to have understanding of risk in the project development or in pricing of credits in the future. It doesn't have insurance. So investors don't know how to assess risk, and they don't know how to assess return, which is why no one's investing in projects. So no projects get started, no credits are generated, no forests are restored, everyone loses. And so another function that Earthshot needs to take, and other organizations need to take, is de-risking the investment process, building sort of more maturity into the to allow investors. And investors are not like institutions; they're actually you. Like you are putting your money into a 401k or another thing, and then those, pension funds or other investment vehicles then invest in carbon credits or invest in these projects. And if that's possible, then individuals can make decisions with their money that have a dramatically positive impact on the planet. And I think that is very, very powerful. And like that more than recycling or driving a bit less or flying a bit less, how someone uses their money and invests their money, and how someone invests their time or their career, I think are like the two most powerful ways of having an impact. So like go work or start a business or work within your organization to change the operations, or the money that you have, the wealth that you've created, invested in something that is good. And right now, if you asked me like, what do I invest in that's good? Very few options, like even sort of an ESG fund. Well, when you look into what it's investing in, is it really good? Like maybe it's not as bad, but it's not like it's catalyzing ecosystem restoration directly. There's no option to do that right now. And there should be, and there can be within a couple years.
So you're imagining that in a new version of how these markets mature, rather than marketplaces that are directly trying to connect end buyers with projects on the ground. So, hey, we're doing this river restoration project in New Zealand. We're going to plant 10,000 trees along the river. Here's our forecast for carbon sequestration and other co-benefits. We list it on an online marketplace, and we try to get people to buy those credits directly. Instead of that model, which seems to be what's trending at the moment, what you're suggesting is that we would be financed more directly through some sort of aggregate fund. And then that fund might also have different downstream investors after that. Maybe walk through how you see the ideal mechanics.
So I think there might be a place for this peer-to-peer investment structure. I think that could be cool. I don't see it as likely taking off. I wish it could, but I just don't see it being likely. There's SEC regulations, for example, for individuals making investments in risky asset classes is not possible, just as a baseline. What someone can invest in is something that is well-defined, well de-risked, like it has sort of like a strong fiduciary responsibility. There are very few operators of reforestation projects that would meet those requirements to actually be able to take off. And so how I see this evolving in the next couple years, and I can share what Earthshot plans on doing that we haven't done yet. One is there are 3 primary classes of capital that could go into reforestation and conservation projects. The first is like philanthropy or catalytic funding. just like $100,000, maybe $200,000 goes into a project, help them set up, go, scope the project out, define what the project area is, maybe run a nursery and plant some trees, maybe do the FPIC process, which is a free prior informed consent where you go talk to the communities and the other stakeholders and like just get the project set up. And I think being a convertible grant, epic use case of philanthropy. The second category would be like bridge financing. The first 2 to 3 years of a project, you have to pay a couple $1,000,000 maybe. And it's pretty risky because maybe it fails for some reason, or like the country decides their carbon policy is going to change, so the project doesn't generate credits anymore, or for whatever reason the operation is a little bit riskier. Just like in solar, hey, before you have a PPP and land secured, like you've got some development risk, but you can still get investment. So let's say it's a higher IRR, like 25% IRR that you have for 2-3 years, and let's say we'll try to set up a $50 million fund in the next year to do this bridge financing to empower land stewards and invest faster. And then there's a third category of capital I think of as like green infrastructure capital. It's good that it has a boring name because boring investors should invest in it. Like your pension funds that have, $500 billion where it's like, I just want it de-risked. I have to have offtake agreements. I have to know, how many credits will be generated. It has to have an operating history. But that allows the amount of capital to scale. And one of the challenges in the market right now is you want to go invest in a project. Well, this project lasts 30 years, maybe 50 years, maybe forever, right? It's sort of like it's more equivalent to a mining concession or an oil concession, very long time horizons. And very few investors invest along that time horizon, right? Do you invest for 50 years? No, you invest for like 2-3 years in each stock or sell. So there has to be a way of getting liquidity. So the third instrument has to be at some point a liquid instrument that could be publicly traded. And so there's a bunch of different options, closed-end, open-end funds that go public, an ETF or like another exchange-traded vehicle that large investors and small investors can get liquidity. So we just went down a little finance structuring rabbit hole for those that are interested. That's how I see this emerging. I don't know if that will be the case. There's also the possibility for blended finance or government sort of public-private partnerships to do these like large funds with the Norwegians who put $1 billion into different projects, or jurisdictional wealth transfers like what Gabon did recently. And I see those as possible and good. I'm skeptical of sending money to governments. Not saying it's bad, but there have been a lot of failure stories where the experience of the land steward doesn't change because the government sent money. And so that's what I really think about. Like, does someone get $50 a month more than they otherwise would have? And if that's the case, then they can maintain it. And if not, then they probably can't.
So I'd love to bring it to different audiences and maybe just recap a bit of what we see as potentially the opportunity for being able to invest funds into this space. So if it's my mom, what we're saying is, ideally there's going to be funds that she can select in her retirement account where they're liquid funds. They trade.
I would say in 3 years, I want your mom to be able to invest in reforestation and conservation. That would be epic. I don't think it'll really happen before then. Right. That would be the timeline.
And then she can feel good about, like, rather than just swap out her plastic bags for reusable, that her actual financial capital is going towards the regeneration protection of the planet. Like, I completely agree. These are the bigger leverage points. And not to say we should also not reuse bags. So moving backward down the capital stack, that kind of middle stage, bridge financing, risk capital, who are the types of investors there and what are the kinds of opportunities?
Well, the truth is it doesn't need to be that many. It doesn't need to be that much money. The big amount of money is in this third liquid long-term holding period. That's sort of like, you can think of it's more like the generate capital like a project finance vehicle. Like there are for energy, for composting, for biogas. There are existing models for how to get a project set up, de-risked, and then sold off. So honestly, $50 million goes a long way. $100 million goes a super long way because you're recycling the capital every 2 years. So you could catalyze many, many, many projects for very small amounts of money. So that's actually the thing I'm most excited to set up in the next year, and deploy capital ourselves, small amounts, $1 million at a time, or less. And I think that will be hugely catalytic. And it'll be really rewarding for investors. And so what we can do to make that possible, just getting a little bit geekier, is in order for an investor to feel really confident that they understand the risk of what they're investing in, the return profile of what they're investing in, we have to have like a quantitative risk framework for what is the project risk. And solar, very easy. Got a power purchase agreement, the land is secured, you know how much electricity it's going to generate, so very few risk factors. Carbon, lots of risk factors right now. There's jurisdictional risk. Like, what if the government just decides that we can't generate credits or export credits to corporates anymore? Can kill the market. Sort of regulatory risk. Well, Vera's methodology might change, or maybe it's incoherent with the local regulatory bodies. So there's sort of like these existential regulatory things, that corresponding adjustments, and Article 6, like, will there be an additional cost, and that'll change the IRR of the project. There's operator risk, which is like, not that many operators have ever planted that many trees before. If you're planting 10 million trees, well, maybe it takes you twice as long, or the prices are twice as high. And, people haven't done reforestation at scale or conservation at scale to really understand the costs associated, and they can be very high. Sort of like financial risks, and it's mostly around price. Like, what if the price doesn't increase? What if it's like $4 a ton forever, and then there's no regulations that come in to build a price floor or a regulatory market, and so the voluntary carbon market doesn't take off? Projects are not investable. Investors made a bunch of investments, but they don't have any return. Natural risk. There's a lot of sort of news around, hey, California a couple of years ago burned to the ground, wiped out the buffer pool for Vera, and everyone said, hey, these credits are not legit. Well, that's true. That can happen. You can just burn it all away. In some regions, right? In the tropics, that's less the case, and most fires are set by humans rather than naturally occurring. But the truth is, we can model those. Like, we can actually build ecological models that assign risk more accurately. So that's one thing we're doing. And then, like, tree growth. Well, what if this is actually something that I'm very proud about, that we've worked on quite a bit, or actually I have not worked on, but Trevor and our science team has worked on a lot, and Polly, is understanding how fast trees grow, and understanding the composition of forests and the different risk factors with climate change. You go to the tropics, but it's going to get drier in some places, it's going to get wetter in some places, it's going to get hotter. But then there's also benefits like CO2 fertilization. Probably no one has ever heard of CO2 fertilization, but there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, means plants grow faster. And because the stomata on a leaf is more efficient when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, it has to open for less time to breathe. So that's kind of cool. So there's all these, it's a very dynamic system. And so we've been using a model called CLM Fates. It's a model that was developed by the DOE and the NSF over the last 40 years. It's what a lot of the big IPCC, climate and ecosystem dynamics predictions are based on. And so we use that at a smaller scale to understand, hey, if you reforest this 100-hectare parcel, what are the effects? All the way from like how fast do trees grow, fire risk, but also like what's the local cooling effect? What's the impact on water cycles in that region? What if you did 1 million hectares? What's the impact on water cycles? It could be massive. It could be a whole atmospheric river that then shows up again in that region. That's epic. Humans have never scientifically understood ecosystem dynamics to that level and applied it. I think traditionally, there's this There's this great movie, Aluna, about the Kogi folks who are like, well, the river is a river of water in the air going from the ocean to the top of the mountain. Like that's the river system. And the fact that you can't see it, or like it's in the air, like science just sort of skipped over that part. And so there's a lot of traditional understanding about how water works, around how ecosystems work, that we just haven't incorporated into our understanding of carbon markets and planting a shit ton of eucalyptus and having private equity companies buy up Paraguay to plant eucalyptus, attempting to sequester CO2, and then realizing, well, that might not be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So the carbon markets are not so simple as just this one trace element in the atmosphere, and we can just really isolate it. What we're talking about here, highly dynamic, variable ecosystems that we're always learning more about as we go. And some traditions might have had a deeper understanding or more nuanced understanding of things that science is just catching up to. But we're doing our best to create models, to forecast, to predict, to get a more holistic understanding of an ecosystem so that we can better make this an investable asset class. And, so you described these kind of three buckets of where the market could mature from a funding perspective. There was the early stage catalytic, get things up and running off the ground. There's the kind of bridge financing. So maybe that catalytic is a couple $100,000. Maybe philanthropy is really well suited for that. Bridge financing, maybe a few $1,000,000 to get a project going. And that's very investable. And there's a number of traditional instruments and types of funds that could really sit there. And then there's the kind of boring green infrastructure, large scale. That's the huge bucket of money that ultimately we need to mature, everything from pensions to open-ended ETFs and the like, but it needs to be liquid because otherwise there's too much duration for capital to be trapped. Does that sound like the basic summary? Is there anything else to add to that?
I think that's a good summary. That being said, it's speculative at this point. We will go into creating those, but maybe it'll be something different. And there's a lot of things that have to go right in order for those to be investable as well. Future price predictions and the solidity of regulatory schemes, like that's very important. And the sort of consensus on verification and how many carbon credits you've issued. So a lot of things have to go right. So it's not just we're setting up a fund and we've solved the problem.
Right.
And this is one of the things Earthshot has run into the last couple of years is what we've realized is that the whole system needs to be solved at once in order for it to be taken off. But that it's very hard for one organization to solve the whole system itself. And so this is why we host events like last night, and why we're hosting an event tonight with, Pachama and Perennial and, other groups, because they're in this for the same reasons we're in this. We want to do our best to restore and protect ecosystems. And we can't do it alone. It's too complex for one organization. So unlike other industries that we're trying to keep secrets and compete with our competitors.
Right.
Instead, let's go hang out together, figure out how to do this, because if we solve this, we address these issues for everyone, and many, many organizations will be required in order to scale this up. So highly collaborative.
Yeah, I even when discussing pre-interview, and I said, are there any areas that you don't want to go into? And you're like, we're an open book, we're transparent. And I love that approach and that ethos because it does feel like it's a requisite for being successful as an ecosystem in this coordination challenge that we find ourselves in. It's so big, we don't need to grab our piece and get into a scarcity mindset. There's so much for everyone to do. But that last night, hosting conversations and just welcoming everyone in and really creating that spirit of cross collaboration and pollination, I think is commendable.
Plus, it's a lot more fun. If I had to be a lot more careful about signing NDAs and not sharing what we're doing and like afraid that our competitors would take what we've developed. Well, what if we just open source the scientific models? Like, what's the bad thing that will then go happen? And what are the good things that could happen? And usually the good things outweigh the risks by a lot.
Yeah.
So the default is to be open.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to go back to some of those risks and challenges you described about the markets maturing. And you mentioned Vera and certification standards. I'm curious, kind of your view. Earlier this year, there was the now infamous Guardian expose about the validity, questioning the validity of a lot of these credits. How do you view the roadmap for creating standards in this field?
Yeah. Hopefully I don't get into hot water by answering this question with too much transparency. I mean, first of all, it's important to realize, like, an organization like Vera, like, they're people, just like there isn't like this monolithic organization out there that's making sort of abstract decisions that affect everyone. It's actually like, there's maybe a couple dozen people that are doing the best they can to synthesize information and make a decision. And so when people complain, what I usually think the opportunity is to actually go make contact and become one of those people that is then making a decision. Because so many people feel powerless, like, oh my God, regulations or like policy or something, like it's too big for me to affect. But the truth is, like, laws are made by very few people. It's like, a few people in a room writing this thing out, getting a bunch of edits, but you can be doing that. And it's the same with methodologies. It's the same with, regulations. It's the same with policy. So I think a lot of the outrage comes from people's sense of powerlessness rather than something that's like, okay, yeah, there were some projects that didn't count the baseline correctly. Okay, like let's recognize that and form scientific consensus on how to measure baselines. And then probably the problem is over. And I think there have been some limitations in what has existed with basically verification and sort of registries so far. One is the inability to form scientific consensus. Like, I would love a system, and maybe this is where your sort of on-chain experience comes, is how do we vote in a way on what models, what, machine learning models. So like how a verification process works is on a big piece of forest. You take a small piece and you measure it very accurately. And then you have a model that then extrapolates it across the whole landscape rather than measuring everything. And how measurement happens is you have a tape measure, you wrap the tape measure around the tree, and you measure the tree. Now we can do that with a phone, which is much better and faster and more accurate, and satellite imagery to help extrapolate across the landscape.
And this is one of the tools you built at Earthshot Labs as well.
We've built Biome, which is a phone app where you just scan the tree basically, and it does the same thing as taking a manual field plot. And one of the ways to increase transparency where that picture and measurement and, AR kit mapping of and tree segmentation model, where it's like all that data then can translate all the way into a final credit. So you see the credit and you see every data point that's ever gone into how that credit was generated and every model that was used. Because maybe in 5 years, someone comes out and be like, I've got a better model. That model wasn't accurate anymore, and this is 5% more accurate. Well, then let's adopt that model. And then let's have the scientists who propose that model, maybe they get paid a little bit for building a better model.
Right.
Epic.
Right.
That's not how it works right now. It's sort of it is a bit slower, stagnant at the moment on how to build scientific maturity. So that's one area that can be improved. Obviously, speed could be improved, the automation and standardization of how projects go through the process, because one of the things that's been a big limiting factor is that because the process is so hard, you need a consultant to do it, and you got to pay them $1 million to do it. So instead, if the process was simpler, a land steward on a phone in Indonesia could do it themselves and get paid for that activity directly and get 100% of the money from an investor or buyer. That would be epic. That's what I see the future being.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a while because there's a lot of challenge associated with paying people directly. As an example, just one of the challenges I see, because I think some folks don't realize how hard this is, which is like a decentralized protocol. There's all these projects like, okay, we're going to form a marketplace to fund or buy credits from individual projects. And I think what people don't necessarily realize is fraud is a problem. And it's not a problem right now so much. But if you can make even $100, what will happen, and it'll happen overnight, like literally the sort of the scam ecosystem, which is a whole very sophisticated ecosystem, will find that out and will build a system to have every document you need, land titles, pictures of trees. You can get on the phone with them, talk through the project operations. Everything will be perfect. And maybe the project doesn't exist, or maybe they don't own the land, or maybe it's totally unrelated. Like they just made up all the information, but you won't be able to tell. And that overnight could turn into 90% of transactions on a decentralized system that where people are verifying things remotely. So I'm hesitant to fully back just a decentralized sort of these sort of unrelated agencies talking to each other. And there's a few sort of protocols trying to do this. And because they haven't hit the like challenge point yet. They're still in the ideation inspiration phase, or this very small number of projects that they can sort of manually verify and go through that.
I would give a plug. It's kind of tangential, but I really like what Nexus Mutual is discovering in that space around insurance, where you have a lot of these same patterns of how do you verify claims, fraud. You have to do some stuff off chain, but coordinate back on chain, and how do you have these decentralized groups? And they're 4 or 5 years in now, with hundreds of millions of dollars of cover being purchased, which is effectively like insurance. So people are kind of interested in that particular niche. Go check them out.
That's a great suggestion. I have a lot of thoughts on how you could do this. We just haven't done them yet because there's so many other problems to solve first, in my perspective. But I really hope someone takes it on.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some of the other risks and kind of challenge areas that you see here? Or which ones are you feeling like are the most likely to create real stumbling blocks?
Yeah. Everything we've talked about so far is like technology and science and software and finance. And there's this saying in a marketplace, there's a hard side of the market and the easy side of the market. And this sort of conventional example, like Uber, for example, the hard side of the market is actually the drivers. The easy side is the riders. Everyone, you just you download an app, you pop in a car. But a driver, you've got to commit hours of your life and like your whole career, and you have to have a car, and it's hard. Like it's physically hard. And so what I don't think people really realize when they're working on this is that the hard side of the market is the project itself. Is like people planting trees or like walking around or dealing with, gold miners who are invading your territory and have guns, and that you're going to get shot if you go talk to them. Like that's a hard side. Like land defenders in the Amazon who like literally just will go get shot or kicked off their land, or like, if you want to talk about the hard side of the market, like that is orders of magnitude more challenging than being like, here's $1 million, go invest in a project. And so we can address all the carbon market, financing stack, scientific consensus, verification, registration, all of that. And then the real work starts, which is doing the projects, scaling up tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of co-ops and tribes and communities to do the work that they want to do. So I just want to like honor why we're doing this. It's for that. It's not about the finance and the science and the software. Totally. Like that's just a means to the end, which is ecosystem restoration and restoration of relationships and livelihoods and land agency, and also realizing that you can't just separate people from nature, right? Like, if you have a bunch of folks who live in the forest, well, it's actually not just a protected ecosystem. Like, it's like agroforestry, like there are food crops and there's hunting, and it's not just about separating the humans. So that's what's going to take a while. I bet we can solve the other stuff more. Like, we're good at financializing stuff and building software, and like we can address that. But eventually, this has to turn into like, and you have billions of people engage with ecosystem restoration.
Yeah. And how do you think about governance? Like, at the local level, one critique I've heard about this emergent field of trying to accelerate climate finance into local land stewards and communities is that it can actually reinforce problematic and oftentimes, opaque, corrupt governance models. And so how much do you feel the task is also to be innovating at that layer?
Yeah, I guess we have to. That's the thing. Like, okay, we solve the finance layer, but it's sort of everything all at once. Because I just think about the Amazon. Like, money pollution is a real thing. Where you go, here's $100,000, and then suddenly it destroys the community cohesion. But particularly for people that haven't had money except maybe in the last 10, 20, 30 years, right? If people, like, if groups didn't have money before then, they don't have like the framework for like almost like an immune system to how to deal with it. And so it gets really tricky. So I don't have an easy answer for that one. Like, I'd say, oh yeah, governance is really important. Obviously, it's super important, but I just don't know what to do about it. And it's going to be, I think, a lot of these systems, right? We can think of, there's a monolithic system for carbon regulation that will be universally defined, and all the jurisdictions will buy in. But it won't be like that for governance, right? It won't, because it's relationship based.
Totally.
Right? It's like every single community is about relationship. And actually, I think it's the same way with carbon markets and regulation and policy. Like, how do policies get passed? Like, how do laws actually get passed? It's not an abstract process. It's actually a relational process where, like, Congress people call up other Congress people and say, hey, are you going to do this? What do you need to do it? Like, it's a network of relationships. And so individuals making decisions. It's not like a, but I don't know how people think change happens, but it's like, it's literally individuals making decisions that you can directly influence. And so hopefully at some point, Earthshot and other organizations actually have the connections, the power, the sort of integrity, but also like the financial and political, clout and network of relationships to go change regulation, to go change carbon policy in the United States, to go scale up nature-based solutions, because right now they're sort of getting short shrift because it's like, it's about energy, and it's around energy sustainability and, national security concerns for, so solar is good. And, but it's about the story we tell, and that's really important. And that's why we host events like last night, because now a bunch of people know each other, and that's good.
And what you said last night at the beginning was, like, we're not, like, all these problems don't just get magically solved in 5 years. Like, we are a community of human beings and relationships that are, and I'm paraphrasing in my own words, but are on this collective journey together. And so it's important to, like, create these touch points, to come together, to connect, and regardless of whichever logo and organization hat we're wearing at any given time or what chapter of our career we're in and so forth. Like, this is a collective journey, and so we need these spaces to meet at that level and to connect. Any other thoughts or reflections from your side on how you're going about that, or how other organizations can go about that in their different spaces and localities?
Yeah. A couple things. One, it's got to be fun. Otherwise, we're just going to get, it's like, this is going to be hard, and it's already hard, and it takes it's going to be frustrating for a long time. So if it's not fun, everyone's just going to get burned out and not do it. So, and it's got to be cool. Like, we can become the cool kids that other kids want to be like, right? And we're like, trees are cool, like jaguars are cool, whales are cool, and I want to do that. Because if it's not cool, then like the finance, like sort of like the pure finance guys win, and like where it's not about love of nature. It's about something that's a little bit distorted from that. So, what's your kid's dream? Is it to, go be an investment banker, or is it to maybe even the same investment banking skills and financial structuring tasks, but it's in service of the planet? Like, that's got to be cooler. I think retreats are really important. Like, they've been some of the ones at Earthshot have been some of the best times of my life. Like, really profound experiences where, like, it's very special when a group of people who are on a common purpose get together and put their intellect and their talent and like their knowledge in, but also their soulfulness and emotional. It's an emotional process that we're going through. It like, in my perspective, there's a function to ecosystem degradation right now. Like, it's not a mistake that it's happening, but there's a function for us to sort of open our hearts as a civilization to what we are doing to the planet, like, so that we feel connected again. So it's a process of reunification, and that is a process that happens through grief, right? And so to have a space where very smart people who are, highly scientifically rigorous and like are the best in the world, but also have a space for shared grief, to open their hearts, to be more embodied human beings, so that people trust them and are inspired by them, and they have more power to go affect their decisions. Both of those are important. And another thing I think we can do is not shy away from the fact that that is true. Because one of the tendencies, I think, right now is to be slightly embarrassed around wisdom, or to be like, you know what I mean? Like, we were sort of like, okay, we'll talk about the consciousness stuff after the call. It was a joke, but it was also not a joke, because what I think that you anticipated is that the people watching this or listening to this would be alienated by things that you really care about, versus being included and being taken seriously. And that's an odd phenomena that happens. Like, why do we judge wisdom, or why do we judge sacredness when we're not in touch with it? So instead, what we need to do is form, groups of people that are sort of like unquestionably epic. Like Trevor, who runs the science department, he's like professor of Berkeley. He's got tens of millions of dollars of grants, top ecosystem modeling, postdoc group, top, maybe not top in the world, but like in the upper echelon of, and everyone knows it. And that can be connected with like a deeper emotional process. And that's great. Like, that's what we're going for at Earthshot, and what I hope other companies are not afraid to also go for. And I think the truth is, sometimes it is polarizing. It's polarizing to institutions that are a bit stagnant themselves, and so it seems fluffy, or it seems not respectable or not professional. But to a lot of people, they're like, thank God we're not bored to hell right now listening to this, right? And that it touches something deeply, so that there are like all those people that signed up for the Slack channel, which is like, thank God I have found something that's worth spending my time on, and I'm not just working to afford my life for my family that I actually love, but I actually can love also what I'm doing. And yeah.
Love that. Yeah, love that. And I think, if nothing else, this time we live in calls for more courage, pushing the edges. If we do things the way we've been doing them, we know what result we're going to get. So, like riding those edges of discomfort, I think we can know that at least we're pushing the bounds of what's possible and acting courageously in this moment.
Yeah. Plus, it'll make me look a little bit less on the edge if everyone else is also on the edge. So,
yeah, well, we'll do our best with that, Troy. No promises. Any other reflections or final messages you want to share, or any other questions I didn't ask, including, please, how do people engage with Earthshot?
Go to our website, earthshot.eco. Obviously, project finance investors and other sort of thought partners in that space is something that we're working on a lot right now. So please reach out. Also, land stewards, project developers, people who feel resonance with this message and are just like, hey, let's collaborate somehow. Let's figure out how. I don't really have anything else smart to say, but this has been lovely. And anyone who wants to hang out with me, come to San Francisco, come to one of our events, or we can go on a walk together. And that's one of the best parts about my work right now, is that I get to meet people from all around the world, and we go on a walk together. We form trust, mutual seeing, and then we work together across organizations, and it's been beautiful. Yeah.
Troy Carter, I appreciate your presence and your wisdom, and thanks for being on with us today.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right, what'd you think? Leave us a comment below. I really liked at the end there where Troy emphasized this idea of how change really happens. You can learn more about Earthshot Labs at earthshot.eco. You might also be interested in the conversations we did with Diego Saiz-Gil from Pachama, Rez from Solid World, and Paul Gamble from Nori. You can find all of those discussions and more at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, and join our community Discord. You'll find me there. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.